eve of the French Revolution, a newspaper in Paris proclaims that the United States was the hope and model of the human race. During the American Revolution, France was funneling support to the Americans because the Americans were fighting the British and France was also fighting the British. So France sent both soldiers and money. This turned out to be a very bad idea for France, or the French monarchy anyways. Before the American Revolution, France was already deeply in debt, and they essentially borrowed money that they could not pay back in order to continue to fight the British overseas. And on top of that, France sent thousands of soldiers to America to fight, so then they're faced with a situation where thousands of French soldiers were returning home full of Republican ideas, revolutionary fervor, and you think about that, these French soldiers just fought a war in the name of liberty and democracy, and won the war, and now they're coming back to be ruled by an absolute monarch in France. Economically, people in France were starving in the streets, the country was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, partly due to the cost of supporting the Americans. So this is hard times for the French. The streets are full of beggars and prostitutes, poverty is out of control, the country is broke. But to make matters worse, the monarchs are continuing to live a very lavish, exquisite court life. Shortly before the French Revolution, King Louis XV dies. By the time of his death, he's a very unpopular king, and the throne passes on to King Louis XVI. Louis XVI was very young when he became king. There's some historical debate about Louis XVI. Some people paint him as being completely incompetent and uncaring for the French people. Other people see him as just a victim of circumstance. The country was already spiraling out of control when he came to power, and he's far too young to really be able to know how to rule effectively. But anyway, to address the poverty and the public's discontent, Louis XVI decides to call what is known as the Estates General. The Estates General was the parliamentary body in old regime France. Louis XVI calls the Estates General in 1789. The Estates General hadn't been called for a really long time, since 1614. The purpose of the Estates General was to bring members of all three estates in France together to meet and to work on solving the problems facing the country. So just backtracking a second, there were three estates in French society prior to the Revolution. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was the commoners. The first two estates made up about 2% of the population of France. The third estate is the rest of the population. In the Estates General, the way it's set up, the three estates had equal power with each other, so it's completely undemocratic. 2% of the population is given majority voice, where the 98% is a minority. So the representatives of the third estate, the 98%, decide that the system's ridiculous. They break away from the Estates General, and they go off and form what's known as the National Assembly, and basically declare that they have the sole authority to make laws for the country. A few weeks later, the National Assembly draws up the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and declares that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. So this is using similar language as the Declaration of Independence in the United States. But despite being inspired by the American Revolution, the French Revolution was a very different type of revolution. The American Revolution was all about preserving rights that had been already established in the colonies, and it was fought against a distant imperial power. The French Revolution was driven by conflicts within French society, turmoil from within. So there were lots of people that supported the revolution in France. The middle class in French society, like doctors, lawyers, merchants, they were really getting tired of privileges that were being given to the nobility. These people were professionals, and they weren't entitled to the same rights as the aristocracy was. But more than that, there was widespread anger among the poor living in the cities and in the country. In the cities, unemployment was rampant. The price of bread kept rising. In the countryside, landlords kept raising taxes on farmers. The state raised taxes on farmers. Farmers were expected to work for free, building public roads. As Enlightenment ideas sort of spread throughout France, it gave people in France sort of a common language to talk about their grievances. So, back to the National Assembly. Once the National Assembly breaks away from the Estates General, King Louis XVI starts building an army to arrest the representatives of the Third Estate. And this basically leads to a mob of protesters in the streets of Paris storming a military prison known as the Bastille, where political prisoners are being held. And the guards of the Bastille put up a fight, 98 lives are lost, and the mob ends up chopping off the head of the prison commander. The mob puts it on a pike and they parade it through town. All of this goes down on July 14th, 1789. So today, July 14th is Bastille Day in France, which is France's Independence Day, their equivalent of July the 4th. So by this point, the monarchy had essentially lost control of the country. The National Assembly had seized power of France, and national decisions are being made by the representatives of the Third Estate. At this point, the National Assembly was divided, and it was divided between moderates, people that wanted to bring about reform more than revolution, and radicals, people that wanted to radically reconstruct France. And in the end, it's the radicals that went out and rise to the top. And once the radicals won out to control the National Assembly, one of their first acts was to execute both King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette. What follows is a very brutal period in French history known as the Reign of Terror. The radical element of the National Assembly creates what is called the Committee of Public Safety, and the purpose of the committee is to weed out anybody expected of being an enemy of the revolution. So Paris becomes flooded with spies, and tens of thousands of people are sent to the guillotine. Really, anybody that has anything bad to say about the revolution has their head chopped off. So there are some radical, if short-lived, changes brought to France during this time. A new calendar is created with Year 1 in 1792, representing the birth of a new society. Months were 30 days long with 10-day weeks, and Sunday was eliminated due to its association with Christianity. All adult males were forced to serve in the military. The new military was led by officers from the lower class and officers from the middle class. Streets were given revolutionary names. Monuments towards the royal family were destroyed. Priests were forced to marry. The state replaced the Catholic Church as the place for registering births, marriages, and deaths. And Notre Dame, the magnificent cathedral in Paris, was renamed the Temple of Reason. Eventually, the leader of the Reign of Terror was arrested by the National Assembly, and he himself was executed for leading France into a period of tyranny. So, by this point, there's widespread disillusionment towards the revolution amongst the public in France. At the same time, revolutionary France was seen as being very dangerous by other European powers, and France was constantly defending itself against its neighbors. So, it's in this historical context that Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power and basically establishes a military dictatorship in France with a lot of popular support of the French people. Napoleon was a big supporter of the revolution, but he went about undoing a lot of the radical reforms made by the revolution, and he preserved the more moderate elements of the revolution, things like civic equality, secular law code, religious freedom, promotion by merit. At the same time, he made an effort to make up with the Catholic Church, and he completely suppressed democracy and turned France into a military dictatorship. Napoleon would go on to conquer much of Europe and spread his version of revolutionary ideas throughout Europe before eventually being defeated by Russian and British forces.